Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer and Jorge, for inviting me. I'm just going to take a second to share the slides. Can you see the slides? Are you able to see the slides? Yes. Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not in presentation mode though.
It is now.
Oh, there you go.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I apologize for having to join you halfway through, but I teach a class in the evenings on food sovereignty. So that's where I was beforehand. So I'm happy to be here with you, and I'm glad I caught a little bit of the discussion after Tegan's presentation. As presented, my name is Kristin Reynolds. I am a faculty member at the New School in our food studies program. The New School is located on traditional and unceded Lenape territory, which I like to acknowledge as part of my own emphasis and commitment to social and racial justice praxis. So I'm going to talk a lot more about urban agriculture. I know there was a question at the end of the last session. So I thought I'd give a little overview of what I mean when I'm talking about urban agriculture and the research that I do. Much of my work is in the action research framework, so I want to give you a little bit of information about what that means. And then I'll provide a few examples from my work, and knowing that this is a forum that's also supported by and thinking about the USDA, I thought I would emphasize a little bit more of some things that I'm working on related to USDA urban agriculture programs. So first, to begin, what I want to say before I move to that slide is to say that I call this some historical perspectives, because there are actually, I think, multiple histories of urban agriculture in the United States and globally. And that's part of what I try to work on is to not just accept the dominant discourse of what urban agriculture is and has been. So I'll get to that in a moment. But first, when those of us who work on urban agriculture, either literally in the field or research or advocacy or all of those things, think about this practice, often we're thinking about the growing of food and non-food crops. So flour, I had a question the other day, does that include marijuana? Yes, it's a crop, right? And the raising of livestock in and around cities, as well as its integration into the social, ecological, and economic fabric of the city. We talk about multiple benefits of urban agriculture that extend beyond the planning conceptualization of the highest and best use of urban land, what will bring the most revenue, either through rent or other profit, to extend to many things that urban agriculture can bring. So this diagram on the slide shows kind of a rendering of this. Examples of benefits are health, access to healthy food, better access to healthy food for some folks, and opportunities to engage in physical activity through gardening, social benefits, meeting people that you might not otherwise meet in a community garden, certain projects that work on youth development or job training, economic benefits like affordability of food, and in the cases of jobs being created, potential for earning some income off of working on an urban farm. And then finally, and perhaps of interest to this particular group, focused on climate, ecological, and environmental benefits, which include things like reducing the urban heat island effect by having more green space in cities, supporting biodiversity, reducing what we have a big problem with in New York City, combined sewer overflow, which is the fact that our sewer system is so old that it overflows quickly when we have a major rain event, which of course happens more and more these days. So these are some of the potential benefits that we talk about when we're thinking about urban agriculture. And I heard there was kind of a question at the very end about like the kind of connected to this thinking about what does it actually look like, urban agriculture. So I think a very common understanding of urban agriculture is community gardens, where people are growing on a small plot for themselves or their family in a larger plot, maybe owned by the city or nonprofit organization. There are also other forms of urban agriculture. And I mentioned a few here, community farms, where oftentimes it's nonprofit organizations, but it doesn't have to be that, growing on at least a little bit of a larger plot of land. It might be an acre, for example, or more, growing food to provide to community members, particularly in low-income communities, and the food is either sold at low cost or given away for free. Institutional farms and gardens include things like school gardens and hospital gardens, prison horticulture gardens. Those would be examples of urban agriculture in institution settings. And then finally, commercial farms, which I'll mention a bit more in a little bit, which are, as the name suggests, farms that are there with the primary motivation to turn a profit and sell the products. So this is kind of an overview of what we think about when we're talking about urban agriculture. So the kind of standard story that gets told about urban agriculture is that the first government-supported urban agriculture in the United States was the Pingree potato patches in Detroit, that land was made available by the mayor of that city to folks that couldn't afford or didn't have place to grow food for themselves in the context of an economic downturn. This example is in the early 20th century. New York and some other large cities saw the creation of gardens that were put into place to teach often well-off, as you can see in the picture, children about nature, and kind of the underlying moral emphasis on this was that industrialization was eking away at people's contact with clean and pristine nature, right? So you can see I'm starting to integrate like these more political understandings of even factual things that existed. In both world wars, in the United States and in other countries, the federal government created programs that were both teaching urban residents, but also a fair amount of convincing urban residents to produce food in cities. If you're interested in old-time film footage, you can Google Victory Gardens and you'll find lots of instructional gardens that tell people how to not only grow food in cities, but also how this will contribute to the war effort. And the logic behind this was to divert rural agricultural products to the Allied forces in the world wars. So then continuing with like kind of a conventional narrative, these are all examples of government supported or institutional supported growing food in cities. There was this kind of waned in the 50s and in the 60s, starting in the 60s and 70s, kind of a second wave of urban agriculture began, which was led rather than by government programs, by community members, individuals, grassroots groups. And so these are kind of some snapshots of urban agriculture as it has existed for a long time. Coming to New York City, where I am located and have done a lot of my work, let's see, I guess not all of you are in New York City, so I'll just say that this is the 5 boroughs, if you're not familiar: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. And so a similar pattern as I was just talking about on the previous slide, in terms of grassroots urban agriculture also took place in New York City, which was also responding to the fact that both in the economic downturn and also due to the actions of unscrupulous and often racist landlords or building owners that might burn down their property so they could collect insurance money. The reality existed that you had this kind of a picture. And so this is often talked about as like vacant lots. We can talk about the critique of that, but just briefly, there's a critique about like, it's vacant to whom? What about the memories, the people that really had their lives there, right? So we'll talk about that later if anybody would like to, but to just bring this back to urban agriculture, in New York City, there were a lot of gardens that were constructed by New York City residents that wanted to clean up lots that look like this and make them into green spaces. And this is in New York often looked at as like the beginning of this grassroots-led urban agriculture movement. That continues to this day. This is a picture that's much more recent, obviously, of a community garden in the Bronx, which also incorporates a casita, which is used by some Puerto Rican communities, which is represented here as not only a place, so the garden is not only a place to grow food, but also to gather and maintain cultural traditions in garden spaces. So I talked about the potential benefits, but I always am compelled to talk about some of the critiques of urban agriculture because it leads into the work that I do. So one critique is that because a lot of urban gardens grow and then sell their food, that they may be feeding into neoliberalization by way of, rather than insisting that government provide food for low-income folks, or even more broadly, that we change our economic system so that people don't need that at all, need assistance, right? That it instead relies on market-based systems, even if it's a farm stand on a community garden site. So this is one critique that exists out there of urban agriculture, that it's kind of standing in for government social welfare programs. A second critique is that the reality that sometimes gardens can increase property values, which then lead to gentrification as long-time lower income residents are pushed out by way of affordability. And then the third critique that I'll discuss is that related to race, class, power, and injustice. So on the slide, the magazine article that says what does an urban farmer looks like was published in New York Magazine in 2010. And there's I've written about this a bit, like there's some really beautiful photos of different farmers and gardeners in New York City. The problematic was that I believe there were 10 people featured and 9 of them were white. And that doesn't reflect at all the community of urban farmers in New York City. And it certainly wasn't, it was certainly upsetting to farmers, advocates, and others in the city who know about the reality of urban agriculture in the city and care about racial equity. And I always think it's important to point out that even some of the farmers, like the person who's featured here, who were in the article, were also upset that like that is not an accurate representation of our movement here. And so the critique then is that without recognizing the ways that representation, for example, in the example that I'm giving, can reinforce power inequities and that are connected to race and class, then we might think, well, urban agriculture is doing all these social justice things like providing food access and providing jobs, without digging deeper to see that there are actually inequities that are being exacerbated by not looking at the larger and deeper structural picture of food inequities. And so these are 4 leading groups in urban agriculture in New York City, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Yannette Fleming is one of the key leaders at the Hattie Carthen Community Garden in Bed-Stuy. La Finca del Sur is a group that defines itself as a group led by African-American and Latina women and their allies working for food and environmental equity in the South Bronx. Ray Figueroa is a leader of some of the urban agriculture programs at an environmental justice organization called Friends of Brook Park in the South Bronx, and is also the president of the New York City Community Gardening Coalition. And Abu Talib is one of the key leaders and elders at Tapqua Community Farm in the Bronx, which is a larger site that includes food production and provides places for youth to gather and learn about agricultural traditions. So I bring these up right now to emphasize the point that this is what urban agriculture looks like in New York City. And so when we see pictures like the one on the previous slide, it's deeply problematic in terms of who's being put forth as the only people existing in this space, which is just not the case. And so urban agriculture has also some general challenges that exist. Policy restrictions not allowing for example, growing food in your front yard, which exists in some cities, certainly restrictions on animal production, difficulty accessing land or having longer term land tenure for urban agriculture, infrastructural issues like accessing sufficient water, particularly in drier places of the country or of the world, and whether that competes with rural agriculture or other uses. another challenge is often finding funding for even basic supplies like seeds or tools, but it could also go up to more expensive things that are needed, like a greenhouse or other infrastructure. These are general challenges. And then the last general challenge I have listed here is the oft vision of urban agriculture as something that at the same time doesn't belong in the city because farms belong in rural spaces, right? That's the argument. Because again, back to the highest and best use, it's a waste of urban space to grow food when you could be getting rent off of a commercial building, for example, or even affordable housing. So there's this perceived legitimacy of like using urban space for food production. And then the other side of that is that urban production has often not been seen as real agriculture. It's just like hobby stuff, like doesn't really contribute to our agricultural food system. So in New York, we've had kind of government support kind of ebbs and flows for urban agriculture. So these two news articles that are about very different time periods emphasize that at different moments over the past 30 years, the city has sought to sell off some of the parcels of urban agriculture that it owns. And a lot of that has been saved by protest and community groups saying, hey, we want this in our space. In some cases, urban nonprofit organizations purchasing the land so the city can't sell it to a developer. So these are general challenges to, these are general challenges to urban agriculture. And before I move on to that next slide, I want to say a couple things. One is that in all of this, I'm talking about the critiques. Overall, urban agriculture, I think, is a positive thing for cities. And then when we think about its contribution to social equity, we have to, dig down into those deeper issues. And that includes challenges that are experienced more strongly by specific urban agriculture groups, which I'll get to in a minute. But what you see here are the general challenges experienced throughout the world, really, in terms of urban food production. So just talking a little bit about the action research approach. All of my work, really, I conceptualize as being action research. There's also the approach of participatory action research. So broadly, these approaches see research as a tool to advance social change. And may be participatory or not. Participatory action research refers to, for example, a community where a problem is going to be studied, being involved in designing the study, conducting the data collection, conducting the analysis, writing up, or otherwise communicating the results. And I always like to point out that that's really meaningful a lot of the times, and it's not the only way to do action research. Sometimes the community members don't want to participate. They don't have capacity. It's not really what they're trying to do. They want help from others to do it. So a lot of times participatory action research, or PAR, gets kind of held up as the only way to do this kind of work, but there are actually multiple sub-approaches, I suppose. So action research has diverse roots, including the three people that you see on the slide. W.E.B. Du Bois was a sociologist in the late 19th and early 20th century, who, among other things, conducted research with Black community members in the Atlanta area, where he was working to document racialized disparities, and was one of the first writing about and bringing out into public discourse a framing of racism as a structural problem. So very important in terms of the development and the starting to think about action and enact action-oriented research, as well as contributing to, among others, the reconceptualization of the way that we might think about racism in this country. Kurt Lewin was a social psychologist in the 1940s who worked with industrial workers in factories to better understand and document their working conditions, but also procedures, so that they could improve their own practices. And he's often looked to as the person who kind of coined the term action research. And finally, Paulo Freire, who was an educator in Brazil in the 60s and 70s, who is well known for his work establishing ideas about popular education. And one of the contributions that he made, and this is written about in the book that you see on the slide, it was to Sorry, I got distracted because my computer turns to a different color once it turns 7 p.m. and that just happened. So he was teaching people in Brazil who did not know how to read so that they could they could be literate and conduct their own inquiries into political and social inequities that were taking place at the time, rather than being reliant on outside elite educated like researchers and educators. So these are 3 of the key figures in the field of action, the world of action research. There are others as well, and I can refer you to the references that you see on the slide for some more history about this. There is critique of action research, of course. The primary among those is this question: is it biased? Because we have an objective to inform social change by doing research. Some responses to this critique include, well, first of all, this question about objectivity is a centuries-old debate in social science. It's not specific to action research. Social scientists study the social world, and we can talk later if you want to have this debate about objectivity, but the debate around whether these questions just kind of fall out of thin air versus we study things because we think they're important is a long one, right? It's not particular to action research. And what is really important in any research, I would say, is that we use sound and rigorous methods, that we don't bias our data, like meaning change the findings because we don't like what they say, or only partially present what we heard or what we identified, right? And so this critique about whether action research is biased, I think, has some really important responses in terms of the way that we as researchers conduct both ethical and high quality research, and that falls to the individual researcher, the research team, to engage in valid research. Biased research can take place in any field. It's not either particular to action research, which is why, again, it's very important to use sound and rigorous methods when we're doing this work, so that we are able to uncover things in a systematic way and then use that information to inform the changes that we might want to inform to make a better environmental and social reality. I fall into the school of thought of critical participatory action research, or critical action research, that has been written about by Maria Elena Torre and her colleagues at the Public Science Project at CUNY, that approaches action research through understanding the diverse histories and origins, using the framing or the standpoint of feminist standpoint theory, and looking at and paying attention to positionality of researchers and what we bring into any research relationship, anything that we're doing with research based on who we are as individual people, our identities, our life backgrounds. So these are some of the approaches to action research that really are the core of the work that I do as a researcher. So now I'd like to give a few examples. This book was mentioned. This I published with my colleague Nevin Cohen in 2016. And Beyond the Kale was a project that had kind of 4 key objectives. We wanted to understand specific strategies that farmers and gardeners were using to advance social justice through their farms and gardens, beyond the general benefits of advancing, increasing food access and the things that I presented a little earlier. We also wanted to understand how those folks were addressing political and economic inequities through their farms and gardens, so that this isn't only about the food, but it's also about these larger structures. We wanted to understand because we knew that existed, so we wanted to get more information about what was going on. Third, we wanted to, responding to that critique slide that I was talking about a few minutes ago, we wanted to recognize and uplift the work of people of color and women in this urban agriculture community in New York City, to recognize that they are the leaders, right? And that is part of the story. I could talk later about the origins of the title of this book if you would like, but it's related to this. And then as action researchers, we wanted to understand if there were possibilities for us as social scientists to do research that, or engage in scholarship that would support the work of the folks that we talked with in this research. It grew out of another project that we were both part of called 5 Borough Farm, that sought to understand just generally what was the landscape of urban agriculture in New York, and develop metrics evaluation tools and policy recommendations to support food production. And in that report, though we didn't ask questions about this, when we just asked a question generally about challenges, a number of folks, both white folks and folks of color, said there's a lot of racial inequity within the urban agriculture community. There's gender inequities, and Nevin and I decided that we wanted to delve further into that, which became the origins of this book, Beyond the Kale, because we wanted to understand and help to make better understood that there were these inequities happening alongside the positive aspects of urban agriculture that we've already discussed. So I won't get deep into the weeds about the methods, but we interviewed folks, and particularly, as I mentioned, BIPOC farmers and gardeners and women who were leading the farms and gardens. We did some focus groups with beyond just individual interviews. We held a public forum at the New School where we had a conversation with both farmers and gardeners, as well as a number of university representatives to talk about how we might work together to advance social justice through urban agriculture. And then we engaged in participant observation, reviewing of policy making and activism, policy documents. Here's a map of all of the sites that were represented in our study. And we came to this using grounded theory, which briefly is an approach that rather than testing a hypothesis through our research, we listen, we see different types of themes arising, and from there we generate kind of some ideas about what we're seeing broadly in our research sample, if you want to talk about it that way. So that's just a little bit about the methods that we used. And so here's the picture again, and I want to just say a few more things about each of these places and folks. So Yannette, what strategies are they using for social justice? Well, holding women-only sessions for community members to come and talk about food and agriculture, making safe spaces on the farm for women, and divesting from this stereotype that farming is only men, right? La Finca del Sur builds on that former idea, and is also creating safe spaces for the women living in their community in the South Bronx, many of whom are immigrants coming from regions of the global South, to again make space for urban agriculture, make social space, and also to uplift the reality that throughout the world, in many parts of the world, the majority of the farmers are women. And so this is part of the mission that they have, is to make those connections between what they're doing in the South Bronx and the global South, thus the name, if you understand Spanish, Farm of the South. Ray Figueroa works with couple of important things that I'd like to highlight. He runs an alternatives to incarceration program for youth on this farm. And of note, in New York City, the majority of youth involved with the criminal justice system are Latinx and or African-American folks. So there's a racial dynamic to this. And he also works with housing justice organizations to create policy platforms that say, hey, it's not farms or housing, we need both things, and like, let's figure out city policies so that we're supporting both of those things rather than pitting them against each other. And he uses a farm as a gathering space for those types of strategizing meetings. And then Elder Abu Talib is making space for youth to learn about agricultural traditions, but also just to have a place to gather in an area of the Bronx that doesn't have a lot of places for youth to go. So these are some of the, I know I'm going over this really quickly, but these are some of the strategies that are being used by the folks on the screen to specifically and explicitly focus on social justice and social equity questions and realities through their farms and gardens, in addition to growing food. And so the last thing I'll say about from the book is that we also asked about challenges. And now you recall the slide I had about general challenges to urban agriculture. Those things exist too, but we also heard about political disenfranchisement. We don't get to talk to the policymakers and some of the other farmers who are white farmers and well-resourced financially have the ear of the city council member and they can get things changed. And we don't have that, right? We don't have people in our community that can like cough up $100 to help us buy a generator. So in wealthier communities, that wouldn't be an issue. And so we are limited and have to find ways around it or do without. Stereotypes like farmers don't want to come in from outside of the city to sell their products at our farmers market because they think that our community is dangerous, or the other another stereotype that gets thrown around. It's probably too casual a way to put it, but people in low-income communities don't like to eat healthy, fresh vegetables. Therefore, I'm not going to go there and sell my products, right? Those are stereotypes. And those are challenges that were articulated by some of the folks that we spoke with in the study in terms of trying to collaborate with larger farms outside of the city to make fresh produce available. That they're not trendy. I'll talk, if I have the time, a little bit about ag tech. At the time we were doing the study, ag tech wasn't quite born yet, but in terms of urban agriculture, but rooftop farming certainly was, and a lot of foundations were interested in funding rooftop farms. And what we heard from folks in the study is like, we don't need a rooftop farm. We don't want to do that, but that's what funders want to fund because it's like the trendy new thing. So this was a challenge as well. And then finally, that there's less support for quote unquote radical work. A couple of folks told us like, we do anti-racism training on our farm and funders don't want to touch that. Now, I think that's a bit different now. Remember that we conducted this research almost 10 years ago now. So I think that now in our current social climate, there's more support for racial justice work. But I would suspect that there is still some reticence among some farmers not farmers, but funders to support that kind of strategizing on a farm. And I suppose by now you have read the quote from Karen Washington, who's a major leader in the farming and food justice space, just kind of summing it up in terms of the uneven power and privileges that exist within trying to make change through the political mechanism regarding urban agriculture and food systems, food justice more broadly. So these were specific challenges that go beyond land tenure, needing access to seed, the general challenges that I presented. Okay, I'm going to try to be real quick. I don't know how much time we have, but I will get through a couple more examples. So here, oops, sorry, I'm not doing a good job with my slides. Now I would like to talk about shifting gears. That's the end of my talking about that book, unless you want to ask questions later, to talk about policy evolutions and USDA programs related to urban agriculture. So first, commercial urban agriculture. I'll talk out of some recent work that I've done with a colleague in Paris and some work that I'm doing here in New York City. So I like to talk about commercial agriculture 1.0, just growing the food and selling it, whether this is an urban beekeeper who's very well known in New York City. I think he has like 400 hives or more perhaps at this point. Rooftop farms, rooftop greenhouses. So these have been in existence for quite some time, growing food in these different ways or raising bees as a for-profit activity. But then ag tech. So ag tech is a term that of course applies beyond just urban settings, but I'm going to apply it to urban. So in, I would say the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot more activity like this, hydroponics, whether it's in warehouses, shipping containers, often grown with grow lights. So like pink is kind of the emblem here, glowing bright pink. Remote controlled or digitally controlled environment, mushroom production. So this is kind of like sweeping in the urban ag scene in the past 10 years. And I'm talking about New York here, but this is really a global phenomenon. At the same time, there have been policy changes at multiple levels of governance that are supporting urban agriculture simultaneously that we're seeing commercial production. I will stop to point out that the USDA defines agriculture, defines a farm as an entity that earned or would have earned, meaning their crop is destroyed, so they didn't make the money, but they would have otherwise, $1,000 in the previous farming year. And so it's by definition commercial, even if $1,000 isn't a lot of money, it still is necessitating a commercial activity. There's also lots of forms to fill out to get that classification. And so it's interesting to me, and thus my focus on this right now, in terms of research, that at the same time we're seeing so much more commercial production, we're also seeing a lot more support from government agencies for urban agriculture. So this includes changing zoning to allow urban agriculture in more parts of cities, proposed or enacted legislation like this position paper put out by Eric Adams when he was running for New York City mayor. Now he is the mayor, suggesting that we can create this new economy by using commercial urban agriculture. And you see the reference to the glowing pink here. At the state level, California in 2013 passed a bill that allows cities to allow property owners to get tax incentives for making their property available for commercial urban agriculture use. And then at the federal level, there's been a lot more attention to urban production through various agencies, including the Agriculture and Marketing Service, the Farm Service Agency, and the Farm Bill of 2018, which created the Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But I want to provide some context when we're thinking about, so I'm doing some research on this right now, and I'll talk about it at the very end, which is coming up. But when thinking about the role and the role of the USDA and the willingness of farmers to engage with the USDA in terms of equity issues, it's, I think, really important to understand or seek to understand kind of some of the historical context around that. So I'll talk a little bit about that. For many years, the USDA has had different programs supporting urban agriculture. The urban gardening program in the 1970s established outreach and technical assistance in I think a couple dozen cities throughout the United States to help people learn how to grow food in cities. The Extension Master Gardener program has also existed since about that time and specifically focused on horticulture and home gardeners. I have a piece here that I wrote about this. I actually wrote my dissertation on this topic long ago, but it's something I know quite a bit about. So these programs existed for a long time. Eventually, the urban gardening program was defunded and so did not exist anymore.
Just a 2-minute warning until the Q&A.
Oh, okay. All right, great. So I'll finish this slide and then I will, got it. The Farm Bill I mentioned, there's been a long-standing grants program for urban agriculture. And then, as I mentioned a minute ago, the Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production was just created through the Farm Bill. So I'm going to do something really quickly because I need to skip my slides, but I don't want to do the annoying thing where I skip through all of them while I'm talking to you. Okay. Sorry about that. Oops, that didn't work either. I'm using up my 2 minutes by skipping through the slides. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so the last contextual thing I'll say before I finish on this is that there's also a long history of the USDA engaging in discriminatory practices toward farmers of color and women farmers in the United States. And I bring that up both in terms of a contextual point in thinking about this new Office of Urban Agriculture, but also in terms, which is also context, in terms of the potential willingness of farmers whose communities have experienced discrimination on the behalf of the USDA to engage with the programs. And so right now I'm starting a project I'm engaged in a research project with Alcorn State University that's looking at this new Office of Urban Agriculture that was created through the 2018 Farm Bill through a racial equity lens, looking at like how is this program rolling out? What are some questions we want to be asking surrounding what's needed to create racial equity through this program? Do those things exist? What are approaches that might be good ideas to consider in this Office of Urban Agriculture as the program and the office continues to exist over time. So what I want to conclude on is that it's important for us, if we're interested in urban agriculture and equity, thinking about its contributions to climate equity, I should say, not climate change, to understand the significance of its potential benefits, where it situates in the broader structure of environmental and food systems inequity, what claims are being made, and where might we want to dig a little bit deeper into those claims so that we can find pathways forward to create more equity through and alongside urban agriculture. And that researchers, I believe, can have a role to play in that, but we really need to always be thinking, I believe, as researchers, as scholars, as students, about the historical context of the things that we're studying and the systems and structures that we're hoping to inform or impact through this work. And so whether it's the context of the history of urban agriculture, who's there, who's represented, the power structures that are creating inequities, whether it's about the historical patterns and practices of government agencies that make people out there outside of the agencies think, not so excited about working with them, so that we can have a more holistic understanding of the systems that we're studying and hoping to improve. So I'm sorry that I went a little bit over, but I'm happy to now take your questions.
Thank you so much, Kristin. That was a great presentation and super on point with what I know a lot of the scholars are interested in, and what Jorge and I are interested in. So thank you so much. Questions, feel free to unmute or